Hi, my name is Adam Robles, and today I have a little bit of a different video. I was fully intending this morning to upload a video about the race issue again, but I actually saw an article by Russell Moore about theocracies that I had to respond to. I completely disagree with Russell Moore on this issue, and I think this article is an especially helpful, instructive way to show why. And so I don't want to throw any shade Russell Moore's way. I think he's probably a great guy. I don't know him, obviously, but you know, him and I would agree on probably a lot of things. So I don't want you to see this disagreement as me sort of warning you against, you know, his ministry or whatever, because it's nothing like that. This is a important point, but not the only thing that matters. And so you know, please don't see this as an attack on Russell Moore, because it's not intended that way. But he's really wrong about this, really, really wrong. And you know, it's possible for a real smart guy to be really wrong about something. And so I wanted to talk about this, and it's about theocracies. And the article is titled "Why Theocracy is Terrible." And so when he kind of advertised this article, the quote he chose to pull out of the article said that theocracies are awful, not only because they oppress human beings, but also because they blaspheme God, which, you know, it interested me. It was an effective quote to sort of pull out to get me interested. But you're going to see as we go through this that he commits a big fallacy that I would identify as the Mott and Bailey fallacy, or you can kind of call it like the bait and switch, or it's kind of a fallacy of equivocation. Basically what he does is he has two positions that he's trying to defend, right? One of them is really easy to defend, and the other one is not, but he keeps going back and forth. So what he's pretending to defend is a super easy thing that almost everybody agrees with, but what he's actually saying and also trying to defend, but, you know, kind of going back and forth between the two is actually not that easy to defend. And so by defending the one but not the other, he makes it seem like he has a really good case, but he actually doesn't have a very good case. And so you're going to see that in just a minute. So let's switch to the article here. So here it is, russellmoore.com, Why Theocracy is Terrible. And then you see this picture here of some unrest in the Middle East. And so that's kind of how he starts off, right? He says Christians, you know, they see the unrest in the Middle East and they recognize that an Islamic state, an Islamic theocracy, is wrong because they're not just, and the reason a Christian might say is because Islamic law is not just. It's got the wrong God, and so obviously if you have the wrong God, you're not going to set up a just society. And so that's really easy to defend. Hardly anyone who's not a Muslim would disagree with that. And so, you know, that's a super easy thing to defend. But he goes on to say that theocracies in general are awful. He says, you know, even if it's you know, a so-called a Christian theocracy, because theocracy just means rule by God. So why wouldn't we want to be ruled by God? He says even if that's the case, theocracies are always awful and abusive, not only because they oppress human beings, but because they also blaspheme God. And he further drives the point home. He talks about this New York Times columnist that calls Iran a klepto-theocracy, that basically the whole point is that they set up this theocracy, but really they just want to steal money from people. And he says, well, that's true of Iran, but it's also true of every theocracy, right? And so that's the main point. He's saying that every theocracy is evil, essentially, and blasphemes God. And sort of the easy, sort of snarky response to this, I saw this on the Facebook post that he made, is very easy. It's, well, didn't God set up a theocracy in Israel? Yeah, he did. So it's a very easy way to refute that. Theocracies aren't always this way, because God set up a theocracy, and so God's obviously not blaspheming himself. And he set this theocracy up after the fall. So, you know, presumably sinful men were kind of running things for him in this theocracy that he himself set up. So it can't be the fact that theocracies are inherently evil. It just can't be that way. It's too easy to refute that. But let's go on a little bit further. Let's not just choose the snarky response, right? And so in this article, you know, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, right? It's not that long. You see, it only goes to here, so I'll link to it. You can read it. But in this article, he kind of gives a few reasons as to why theocracies are bad. And so I identified 8 things that he kind of defines a theocracy as, right? The first one he says is that theocracies financially fleece people out of money and property. So he mentioned that in the New York Times article guide. And the question is, does every theocracy do that? Well, no, that's obviously not the case. God's theocracy didn't do that. You know, when God set up the theocracy in Israel, the point was not to fleece people out of money and property. So the answer to that is clearly a no. He also says that a theocracy is an illegitimate claim to rule the whole cosmos, right? It's almost like a claim to be God. And the question is, does every theocracy do that? Well, no, God's doesn't. God's theocracy that he set up had nothing to do with people claiming to be God. It had God as the ruler of the cosmos. God was setting up the law, and people were applying that law. So, no, that's not true of every theocracy. Number 3, a theocracy means that people come into the kingdom only because they're cowering before an earthly power. Again, God's theocracy didn't do that. Okay? He also says that a theocracy is a claim to messianic authority. Was God's? No. So you see, I could go. I'm going to give 4 more points, but the whole point is there's no nuance here, right? So every time he talks about a theocracy, all he says is theocracy without nuance, and really, it's just a bootleg theocracy he's talking about. He's not talking about a Christian theocracy, because if a theocracy had claimed to have messianic power, then it would not be a Christian theocracy. It wouldn't be a theocracy that God would be a part of. And so it's just weird. Again, every point he makes about theocracy is really about a bootleg sort of false theocracy. A 5th one, he says, a theocracy is a claim to rule on earth by divine appointment. God's wasn't. God's got, you know, the people that were ruling in Israel, they weren't saying that they had a special sort of appointment by God that what they said mattered more than everybody else. No, they weren't saying that. They were just implementing God's law, right? Another point, he says, a theocracy claims to speak where God has not spoken. Again, God's theocracy didn't do that. Because the people who ran Israel, they were applying God's law. So they were only speaking where God did speak, right? Well, at least that's how it was set up. You know, he talks about how theocrats would basically be applying secret revelations. Again, that's not the case. A theocrat in a Christian theocracy would be applying God's law. It wouldn't be secret revelation. It'll be the revelation that everybody has, the scriptures, right? He finally makes the point at the end of the article that a theocracy in every situation, so again, there's no nuance here. Every theocracy is motivated by financial gain, political power, or sexual pleasure. And again, God's theocracy is not motivated by that. So again, he's applying all of these things, and he's just applying it to theocracy in general, and really, it's all he's refuting is a false theocracy. None of these apply to God's theocracies. You know, those, you can't say that anyone, and full disclosure, I would advocate for a Christian theocracy. I think it's pretty clear in Scripture. But you can't say that a person like me who would advocate for God's theocracy is saying that we would make up all these laws where God has not spoken, right? We wouldn't do that. So Russell Moore is sort of doing this bait and switch where he says he's talking about theocracy, but really he's talking about a false theocracy where everyone is just using God for power instead of applying God's law the way he intends people to do. And so it's this Mott and Bailey fallacy. He sort of he has this very strong position where he can refute easily false theocracies, and that's easy to defend. But all the while, he's pretending to defend the Bailey, the more difficult point that he's making. What I found interesting about this was all of these points that he makes about, you know, messianic authority, speaking where God has not spoken, being motivated by money and power and greed, claiming to rule everything. They don't apply to God's theocracy, the Christian theocracy. They don't apply to this theocracy that God set up in the Old Testament. But they do very easily apply to democratic power, to democracies, in other words. Because here's the thing, all governments, all democracies even, are all motivated by these things. All of these things will claim to speak about morality where God has not spoken. So all of these criticisms equally apply to democracies as they do to false theocracies. And so if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. If this is an argument, these pragmatic kind of points are an argument against theocracy, well, then it's equally an argument against democracy, and where are we? It's equally an argument against autocracy, so then where would we be? The point is that none of these things are actually good arguments against theocracy. They're just kind of pragmatic, ills that basically identify the reality of sinful man, right? And again, it's a reality, and it's pragmatic, and maybe they're true, but it's not a good argument against democracy or theocracy or autocracy. This is a situation we have to deal with it. You might say at this point to me, hey, Russell Moore might not have given a good argument against theocracy in this article, but he's still right. Because if you have a theocracy based on God's word, it would still be abused by sinful men. And because it would be abused, it would end up blaspheming God, because sinful men would apply a theocracy in an inconsistent way or in an evil way, because, people are imperfect, people are sinners. And so Russell Moore is still right. And to those people, I would say, okay, well, let's just say that he was right for a second. That's also true of democracy, right? Because sinful men are running a democracy. So wouldn't you rather have a system where the goal was to apply justice, real, godly, biblical justice, applied imperfectly by sinful men? Or would you rather have a system where the goal doesn't have anything to do with God's justice? It's just make it up as we go along kind of justice, and have that applied by sinful men. I mean, it doesn't really seem, even if he's right about that, and that's what would corrupt theocracy, it would definitely corrupt democracy even worse. And so I still don't think he's right. But to even more so, the question that I have for Russell Moore and for anyone who would agree with this is, how big is your gospel? Like, seriously, how big is your gospel? Because I know Russell Moore preaches the real gospel, right? But I think it's deficient, because he would have to agree, and everyone I think that would read this article or watch this video would have to agree that the gospel regenerates people, it changes people, and it changes how they deal with their personal lives, like in their personal conduct, right? When you're saved by Christ and you're regenerated in your spirit, it changes how you treat your wife. It changes how you raise your kids. It changes how you deal with your neighbors. All of these things are completely changed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so you're conformed into the image of Christ. And so you start to do things that you start to treat people the way Christ would treat people. And you won't do it perfectly, but that's what starts to happen. And so as you grow, you're going to be growing in grace and in sanctification, and you're going to be more and more like Christ every single day. Well, why can't that apply to politics, right? Why is it only in your personal conduct? So if a Christian gets regenerated, why aren't his politics also sanctified? Why wouldn't the way he would rule? Let's say a Christian was a mayor or a senator, or God willing, even the president, right? Why wouldn't a Christian, a real regenerated by the Spirit of God Christian, why wouldn't he want to rule the way Christ would rule? Why wouldn't he want to set up a system of government the way Christ would set up a system of government? Because if he's being conformed to the image of God, if he's being conformed to the image of Christ, right? Why wouldn't he start ruling and setting up a system of government that acknowledges Christ in all these areas? Basically a theocracy, where his ideas of what the right laws are and his ideas of what justice is are put aside, but God's idea of justice and God's idea of what the right laws are emphasized and are elevated. That sounds an awful lot like a theocracy to me. And so I would ask Russell Moore and anyone who would think that imperfect sinners will always corrupt a theocracy, how big is your gospel, man? How big is your gospel? The gospel can change politics, and the gospel can change government, and I think it will. I wanted to read the last paragraph of this article because I think it's pretty interesting, right? So here we go. It says, God has told us how to come into his rule by following the self-sacrificial way of the crucified Christ. That entails a call to carry the gospel to the nations, not to subdue them for our own gain. That entails a call to consciences to hear and to receive the gospel, not to run over consciences with the threat of death or loss of money. Theocracies are terrible because the God behind them is the root of all the horrors of the present age, a depraved humanity pretending to be divine. So I guess back to the mop then, huh? So here's the thing. He sets up this dichotomy. He says it's all about self-sacrificial service to Christ, carrying the gospel to the nations, not conquering the nations. And look, let's just be flat out honest. If a theocracy was conquering nations violently and saying you must convert to Christ or we'll kill you, that's not a godly theocracy. That's not a Christian theocracy. So again, what are you refuting here, right? You know, this article would be really good if it was actually just about bootleg theocracies. If it was just about a fake false theocracy and all these systems of government that pretend to be theocracies but aren't. It would be a really good article because it does refute that. But that's not what he says it's about. He says it's about all theocracies. You know, the last sentence is amazing, I think, because he actually kind of, this is my whole point. He says theocracies are terrible because the God behind them is the root of all the horrors of the present age. And here's what he says the God is: a depraved humanity pretending to be divine. That describes democracy. That describes autocracy. Because in democracy and in autocracy, the God of those systems, the lawgiver, the person who decides what is moral, what is not, what is justice, what is injustice, is humanity, not God. That sentence doesn't describe theocracy, or at least a Christian theocracy. A Christian theocracy seeks to remove man from the equation as much as possible. It seeks to apply God's justice, and God is perfectly just, and he sets up systems that are perfectly just. And so, Russell Moore, I don't know why you wrote this article. I don't know. I honestly don't get you sometimes. But the point is, that last sentence gives the whole debate here. You're actually not talking about Christian theocracies. You're not responding to anyone who would, like myself, would seek to set up a Christian theocracy and promote it. What you're talking about is fake, false theocracies. You're talking about bootleg theocracies. And so I would stand with you against that. But let's not pretend that you're refuting all theocracies with this article, because that's not what you're doing. And so with love and with respect, I just have to say that this kind of article, it just muddies the water so much that it's just completely unhelpful. Let's focus on setting up Christian theocracies where we can apply God's law as best we can. We'll never do it perfectly because we are sinners. But God's law applied imperfectly by people is much better than man's law applied imperfectly by people. And I think God would honor that effort as well. I think he would give us insight into the scriptures more than we've ever had before. If we as a group, as a nation, decided we want to honor God with our laws, and we want to look into the scriptures and see how should we apply the law that he gave Israel. I mean, it's not going to be a one-to-one application a lot of the time, obviously. But I think God would honor that, and I think the gospel is capable of producing that. You know, this is really a gospel issue. It really is, to me. The gospel absolutely saves souls for eternity, but it also saves us now as we are now, politically, personally, as a family, the whole kit and caboodle. So God bless you. I thank you for watching this video, and obviously comment below. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, but God bless you.